We're here to discuss this book, Small Acts of Resistance, by Steve Crawshaw and his colleague John Jackson. It's a fascinating book. It talks about little things that people do in societies to make change. And just flicking through, it's Afghans voting for singers in a television show to show that they can exercise their choice. Burmese stringing pictures of oppressive military officers around the necks of stray dogs in Rangoon, and Peruvian women having a mass washing of dirty laundry that helped bring down the quasi-dictator Albert Fujimori. The foreword is by Václav Havel, and he says, it's worth noting this because he was a pioneer of the East European, the collapse of communism. The rebellions that took place all across Eastern Europe in 1989 were the result of a series of individual actions by ordinary people which together made change inevitable. These small acts of resistance have had incomparably greater impact than anybody could have predicted. On the panel we've got Steve Crawshaw, who we will hear from in a second. We've got Saeed Kamali Degan, an Iranian journalist who writes frequently for The Guardian, the head of the BBC Burmese service, Tintar Sway, and Alice Ukoko, who's going to tell us about small acts of resistance in Africa. We're going to ask Steve to open and then get examples from everybody here of little acts of resistance, have a discussion, and then open it up to the floor. So, Steve.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for the Frontline for hosting this, indeed for all of you being here. It's great to see a full room, and therefore I guess part of the enthusiasm that my co-author John Jackson and I had in putting this book together. I'll say by way of introduction a little bit of kind of how we got to the book, and then I'm really interested to hear what the colleagues on the panel have got to say, because obviously those are some of the most burning, the areas of such enormous importance today. But my own biography is slightly relevant perhaps to this. How John Jackson, who used to work for the Burma campaign, now works for MTV, and I came up, we realized there were lots of these untold stories of things which had had much, much greater impact than people realized. And many of the stories within the books had never really made headlines at the time, but we felt did have the real impact. My own biography, I was a journalist many years at The Independent, then at Human Rights Watch, and now recently, the last few months, moved to Amnesty International. But through those different hats that I've worn, it was remarkable to see really extraordinary change. And one of the things I guess that again and again had in common was finding enormously wise and clever and very confident people who would say, oh, this can never change. And they told you with enormous authority of why situation X simply would not change, and why the particular people who were seeking to create that change, they were kind of all very nice and they were very well-meaning and it all made sense, no doubt they were trying to, but frankly, the whole thing was completely doomed. And time and again over the years, I saw how utterly wrong that could be. And Humphrey referred to the preface by Václav Havel, which went back to partly the reason for asking him to write the preface, and it was great that he did, was an essay which many of you may know called Power of the Powerless, written in 1978. And the Power of the Powerless essay talked about how if everyone stood together and changed things, then things could change like that. And people basically said to him, Václav, dear, you know, you're a nice guy and it's a lovely idea, but it ain't going to happen. That was 1978. A couple of years later happened Solidarity, the mass movement in Poland, which changed everything dramatically in Poland and therefore in Eastern Europe. And only a decade after he'd written those words came I was lucky enough to be in Wenceslas Square for the Velvet Revolution and the collapse of communist regime in just 10 days. I was living in Poland in 1980, where, again, in terms of disbelief, the Solidarity movement grew up and defied the regime fundamentally at a time when, don't let's forget, Leonid Brezhnev was still alive, the guy who'd sent tanks into Czechoslovakia and then more recently into Afghanistan. And yet Poland was able to stand and say, okay, if you want to send the tanks in, send them in, but we're here. They got the legalization of Solidarity, and when Solidarity was banned, they had wonderful ways of resisting, some of which are in the book. For example, in order to protest against the lies of the TV news, they would end up not just protesting and not watching the TV news, but putting television sets into prams and walking with prams through the streets of one particular Polish town. The police were furious, but they didn't quite know how to arrest because there were no slogans. And so eventually, not knowing how to handle this, they merely, if you say merely, brought the curfew forward. There was tanks on the streets at the time. They brought the curfew forward from 11 o'clock at night until 7 o'clock at night so that people couldn't go out during the 7:30 news bulletin, whereupon the protest moved till 5 o'clock, which was the early edition of the news, and so on and so forth. Poland had many of these. Others were demonstrating in favour of the regime, which rather embarrassed the regime. People demanded better working hours for the secret police. And again, they kind of arrested, but weren't quite sure what they were arresting for. And so it went on. You can say, oh, it all seemed nothing. But actually, all of these put together created what led to the communists giving way in Poland in late 88 and then 89, allowed some half-free elections, which were then they lost so devastatingly that it led to a non-communist Solidarity Prime Minister, which in turn paved the way for the fall of the Berlin Wall 3 months later. And that, again, people say, oh, it was Reagan who managed to do it. Oh, no, it wasn't. It was Gorbachev who did it mostly. Oh, no, it's because someone picked up the wrong document at the wrong time at a press conference on November the 8th or 9th. Actually, it was none of those things. It was the things that ordinary East Germans did. Those were the things that created the change. And so that kind of pattern of stuff across the years kind of fascinated me. And I love the fact that there's a lot of mischief within it, including, we'll hear, I'm sure, from others as well, but Burma and Iran and other places. Each of these places, even in the most horrendous circumstances, people will, perhaps especially, retain an unbelievable mischievous sense of wit, which says, you can come and arrest me, but I will make a mockery of you at the same time. And they're making mockery. There was a nice quote from one of the Serb opposition members, or not opposition actually, they're better than the opposition. They were Otpor, which was the student movement, who hated the boring opposition politicians, but who fundamentally ended up defeating Slobodan Milosevic, the Serb leader, much better than the opposition politicians had done. And one of the Serb opposition guy, one of the Otpor people said, I'm laughing at you and you're beating me, You're the loser and I'm the winner in that circumstance. And he was absolutely right. And within a year, Milosevic was gone. So those are some of the kind of pattern. I think I would, just a couple of quotes, which almost, they aren't epigraph quotes, the book, but they almost could be. And I think for this evening, in terms of the question of the evening is, can unarmed, I've forgotten what title it is.
Unarmed.
Unarmed,
it's definitely
unarmed,
yes.
clearly. A resistance, can it still defeat? Can it still make these changes? And I think that what we've seen in the past, heaven knows what will come, but all that I feel able to say is we've seen again and again that people said it couldn't be done, and actually it has been. So why would we now believe that where it's been done elsewhere, it can't succeed? The Polish writer Czesław Miłosz had a great quote. This is 1987, so before Solidarity had won. It was still when the movement was banned. But he said, our natural tendency to place the possible in the past leads us often to overlook the acts of our contemporaries, who defy the presumably unmovable order of things and accomplish what at first sight has seemed impossible or improbable. He was proved absolutely right in Poland, and I think he can be said that there have been many other places where that same kind of defiance is saying, well, you may say we can't get anywhere, but we're sure as hell going to try. And they try, and I would like to think that the rest of us, what we can do is give them the comfort by not giving up on those changes, believing that change can happen, and creating the pressures which can in turn help them in their own countries. So that's
excellent. What I'd like to do is to ask each of you to give a little example. So Alice, perhaps we heard about Eastern Europe and about television sets in prams. In Africa, what are these little signs of resistance?
I think one I will be doing a disservice, if I don't mention, is the one that of the Liberian women. That women are the pillar for change, that women, they are peaceful, we do peaceful things, and we stand against quite a lot of guns. You can kill us because we fight for our children. They are our future, so we do everything that we can for them. We saw how in 2003, this was not seen by the world because this was a time where Iraq was very much on the agenda. But it turned out that the Liberian women were able to force Charles Taylor to talk peace. with the opponent, not them. They didn't participate. They just said, well, we're going to defy you. We're going to stand in front of your guns. We're going to stand against everything you have. We're going to fast and we're going to pray, but the killing must stop. And we know that Charles Taylor is now standing trial in The Hague for what he did, and peace came. Who knew that peace will ever come to Liberia? But it did, and it came through simple resistance. In 2002, I also was able to see the African women in Niger Delta. For a long time, over 50 years, the Niger Delta has been the underdog that was being the world, and yet nobody knew anything about what was going on in the Niger Delta, what the oil companies were doing in the Niger Delta, how our environment has been destroyed in the Niger Delta, how our people are being killed in the Niger Delta. But on the 8th of August, ordinary women decided, right, we want to talk to Shell. If we can't talk to our government, we will talk to Shell. We will stop Shell from doing what Shell is doing. We want to tell Shell that we cannot continue to borrow money to educate our children. Then we begin to borrow money to give them pocket money. So the women took off very early in the morning and went in front of Shell and said, we want to talk. We need to talk. You cannot be operating in our lands, and yet you've destroyed our livelihood. So we are going to stand here until you talk to us. Unfortunately, Shell decided to call on the Nigerian government, and they brought arms to bear. And it was interesting because the women, all they had in their hand was just pure water, nylon bags of water, and that was all they had. And the soldiers came, the armed police came, guns were walking, horse whip was at work, but the women said, we are not going to run. There's a particular woman with a child on her back, and he said, I will not run. I'm going to stand here because we need to change things. And it really made a change, because of that single act, the whole world became aware. America came, Amnesty International came, and today we see here about the Niger Delta women. I will stop now.
Okay, thank you. Burma, though, is a tricky one, isn't it? Because we hear about these little acts of resistance, and yet nothing seems to make the generals budge. Is there anything that you've noticed?
Well, I wouldn't say that nothing makes a general budge, you know. Obviously, they are very worried. If you look at what's going to happen in November, the elections, it takes them almost the whole year to announce the date. There are small resistance. One of the things I like to mention here is what's happening in the army itself. A lot of army units in Burma, what normally happen is rank and file, they have to, the unit cut certain percentage of your salary for savings. And this saving is, if you're a bachelor, they cut higher percentage. If you're a family man, they cut less money than the bachelor salary. But the army, you have to remain in the army for 10 years, which means after 10 years, you must have accumulated quite a large, savings. But when the soldiers want their money back, when they want to withdraw the money, the army refuse it. So that is what's happening now. These monies are all belong to the military called Myanmar Holding, MEHC is Myanmar Holding Company, which is belong to the military. And currently what is happening in Burma is several units, the soldiers are rank and filed, and in some units, even the officers, they are disobeying orders, and they refuse to, they are staying out of the army compound, working outside. They refuse to come back to the unit, mother unit, and this is happening currently. And even today, we just cover a unit near Rangoon in town Ukla, which is not far from Rangoon. They're going through the similar problem. So to answer your question, Humphrey, the generals are very, very concerned about it, and they don't know what to do with this. If they try to start withdrawing money, allow the soldiers to withdraw money, then the soldiers are going to desert the army. All they want is take the money and run away.
Okay.
Having said that, they are now facing, I just got today that last month 5,000 people soldiers deserted the army.
Okay, so we're looking at a tipping point there, perhaps, aren't we? Which brings us on to Saeed, because there's a huge story going on there, isn't there, which you've been personally involved with. But what are the acts of resistance there that could see movement in Iran, and which direction might it go?
First of all, I think Small Acts of Resistance is a very brilliant book, and it has very good examples of Iran resisting to the regime in it. And we've all seen how Iranians have succeeded to speak, to tell the world what is the true story in Iran, and that is the big achievement for Iranians, I think. Although Mousavi is not the president and there was a rigged election, but there was a big achievement, and that's the way the world is seeing Iran. And the Iranians, there is a big distinction between Iranians and their government, which we couldn't see that distinction before the election. And it's because of all these protests and the creative methods that people use to have resistance to the regime.
Are there any televisions in prams or anything like that?
Yeah, there are. The interesting thing is that when I read the book was the similarities between these all resistance and protests between all these countries. Steve talked about protests in favor of the regime that you said. It happened in Iran where people exploited the Al-Quds Day, which is the day people protest in support of the Palestinians. And then people decided to go out in mass population to show how huge they are, and they did so, and it was a very good sign to show to tell the regime, how big they are. But there are different examples. Everybody knows Neda Sultan, who was killed in the aftermath of the election, which changed the way the world saw Iran, which is very important. And there was an example where people decided to shout Allahu Akbar on the rooftops, which means God is great, and which is the same slogans they shouted in the 1979 for the Islamic Revolution, the same tactics. And everybody talked about Twitter revolution and Facebook revolution in Iran. While before that, nobody was even imagining that Iran has internet. When I was in London before the election, everybody was asking whether we have internet in Iran, and everybody was shocked to see that people are talking about Twitter revolution in Iran. And nowadays we see this stoning woman, Sakina Mohammadi Ashtiani, and how people are outraged to the case. And it's very amazing how people are unified in less than a month to tell Iranian regime that how outraged they are to the case. So there are really different examples in Iran that we could mention.
Steve, in your introduction, you rather dismissed Reagan and Gorbachev and the global momentum that was taking place. But here we've got two countries here that have got these oppressive regimes that have been trying for years to move them, and there hasn't been substantive movement, little things. But do these small acts of resistance, can they have an impact if there's not an outside momentum to take them somewhere? Or are the people that try them just going to end up in jail or killed?
I certainly wouldn't want to dismiss the importance of international pressure. On the contrary, I think the reason I mentioned Reagan and Gorbachev was because Reagan and those who loved him afterwards seized it as though none of it would have happened without them, and the people who actually risked their lives were somehow irrelevant. And Gorbachev, although he did a lot of good things by not being in love with tanks, which his various predecessors had been, was not the person who had deliberately unleashed the changes. Again, people risk their lives in order to create the change. But you're absolutely right that you can't then just part of it is if you stand by and say, well, nothing's going to happen, as, for example, German leadership did during Poland in 1980, Solidarity, they kind of said, well, this causes instability, we don't want this to happen. And the then German government, the then German leader Helmut Schmidt, was actually highly critical of Solidarity. He was pleased when the tanks came in because he thought that brought back, quote, stability. Well, of course, it wasn't stability. It was a false stability. So you're absolutely right that the pressure needs to be there. And for example, on Burma, on Myanmar, we have seen far too little of it. We have again and again, before I came back to London to be with Amnesty International. I was based in New York and doing the UN work there, and it was absolutely shocking to see how the Security Council, including China and Russia, but others who should really have known better, didn't want to put any kind of pressure on Burma, the kind of pressure that's clearly needed. And when briefly ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, when they very briefly after the big process in 2007 spoke out, the generals kind of backed off a little bit, but immediately then the pressure stopped. So that pressure is extraordinarily important. And on Iran, for example,
there is pressure on Iran, isn't there?
Well,
all the
yeah,
time.
there's pressure, but it's like it's a one-track kind of pressure. Usually, it's to do with the nuclear threat. And I'm not saying that nuclear issues are unimportant, but the human rights issue, briefly during the elections itself, then we saw people actually caring about real Iranians and what real Iranians wanted. But now what we're seeing again is that the standard narrative that we're hearing from the big powers is all to do with nuclear and what should or shouldn't happen in nuclear, rather than looking at Iranian society. And Iranian society, as we've heard, has very clearly shown what's needed. And absolutely, they are looking for a sense of being supported from elsewhere. Yes. And there are other places, Uzbekistan, many in Central Asia, many places where there are different economic reasons why different governments will absolutely
But is it not, Alice, you come from a huge canvas of a continent that has a dictatorship on one hand and a democracy next to each other and a complete mess here and there and the other. Take what Steve says there. You have these very original things. I've been in Africa and where there's no petrol and there's no cover.
There's
and
nothing,
the ingenuity
no
of the people in Liberia that I went through is absolutely fantastic. And you wonder, why can't this intelligence be used to create the country? But it's the people, isn't it? Within. Is it really external influences, or is it the people?
I think what's happened, because I've just come back from Nigeria only June here, what people kept asking is, Alice, tell us, is all this campaigning you are doing having an impact outside? So really what they are waiting for is the whole world standing up and saying, leave these people alone. So really, I think in case of Africa, you look at Africa, then you look at the leaders that are holding the African people down. They come out, they attend the G20 summit, and they are dilly-dallying with the rest of the world. So the African people, the feeling is that, oh yes, the leaders are working with the West. So what can we do? So people, and of course the resistance, because I've actually taken women on to charge on the ground. I say, what's going on? You are sitting here, you are sitting quietly, you are waiting for some kind of messiah to come from outside. And they say, but we are resisting, they are killing us. So, and they say, we are trying, but they are killing us, and people are not hearing about that. So we have that. So the issue of Africa, when we talk about democracy, Ghana, I've been told last Sunday that people think there is democracy in Ghana, but there isn't. So people on the ground know differently, they know better as to what is actually happening. But in actual fact, the picture that is created outside, and that is what the governments are doing, is very different from what is happening on the ground.
I'd like to bring in the two real live cases we have here, because when you witnessed Eastern Europe, we were dealing with societies that had fairly mature institutions. They might have been corrupt and dreadful, but they were fairly mature. Whereas in Burma, for example, there's 22 different tribes, and there's the military down, and education is, and all this sort of stuff. If these small acts of resistance, non-violent resistance, succeed, what will happen eventually? How do you see it unfolding?
Let me tell you something that's happened recently. You'd be surprised to hear that there is a trade union formed inside Burma. It started by a group of lawyers working for people who've been arrested, whose land been confiscated, and who's been forced to work for the army. So there are a group of lawyers helping these people. And now they have moved one step forward and then form trade union. What they have done is they have written to the Senior General Thanshui, he's the guy who's running Burma, and written to him saying that they have formed this trade union, which means informing him that there is a trade union. So until today, nobody has done anything, nobody has touched them yet. So there is a trade union. And there is another small group, a handful of people, trying to make people aware of their rights. It's a human rights group. And now a lot of people are coming to see this group of people and then asking for their help, like people whose rights been abused, the farmers, child soldiers. Through this group, a lot of people been, like child soldiers, they are reunited with the families. So there are pockets of resistance and who are trying to, little small acts like Steve mentioned in his book, and they are very, very effective, you know. And then the government has not, would not dare to touch this group. It shows that there is some improvements you can see inside the country. What you're trying to say, Humphrey, the larger scale, like 2007, when the whole nation protested out of the blue, the government was not prepared for it. It's just that they increased the fuel price for 500%, and then suddenly people were so upset, they came out, and then it grew and grew, the protests. Eventually, it was cracked down, brutally cracked down. But the fact that it's been always when the people came out onto the streets and the military would take their guns and shoot and, you know, brutally crack down. But then it's still, there is undercurrent, and the government knows that it can happen again. When it happened again, they might not be able to control.
Does it have a tipping point with its neighbours? Because this pressure that we've been talking about doesn't generally come from Singapore or Malaysia or Thailand, does it? But these are its immediate neighbours are the ones that are going to have to carry Burma through at the end of the day, aren't they? Is there a line that the generals won't cross with those countries?
What we heard is that ASEAN, as far as ASEAN is concerned, the generals are not, they don't think very highly of ASEAN. However, they use ASEAN as a bridge to have a channel with the United States. So it shows that they do take into consideration of the United States and then United Nations. Going back to what you said, how much ASEAN can help, we all know that ASEAN has done very little in respect to Burma, but then there is a China factor. Everybody's saying that China factor is important, and ASEAN is trying to toe the line because of the Chinese factor. I think if it has happened, and we strongly believe that given the situation in Burma, it can't remain as it is now. And when it's happened, it will come from inside. And when it's happened, it will be the people who will try and improve the situation, which means the reform will happen inside. And please don't forget, there is Aung San Suu Kyi. You know, she is not only symbolic. You know, she has a lot of people have a lot of faith in her. And if once she is released, nobody knows what's going to happen. And the generals are so worried to release her.
Saeed, will many acts of non-violent resistance see Iran through to the sort of changes that you would like there? If not, what other factors would come into play?
The problem with Iran is that people are very creative and about creating all these resistance acts. The government is also very creative. And
Iranians are creative.
Yeah, Iranians are very creative.
Whichever side they're on.
And so this is the problem. Even with the nuclear issue, Iran is playing political games very, very better than the West, especially US and the UK.
But is it the West that's needed there, or is it the small acts of resistance? Which one is?
No, small acts of resistance is needed. And I remember when I talked to Zahra Rahnavard, wife of Mousavi, the reformist Mousavi, she was saying that we're not looking for the support from the governments of the Western countries, but from the people and the artists.
Yes.
And they are happy that they are saying it. I've seen hundreds of clips and songs that was made and written after Neda's death, when she died. So they are looking for the intellectuals in the Western countries than the governments. Like the stoning case, for example, the recent example. When Hillary Clinton commented about Sakina Mohammadi Ashtiani, they put the poor woman on the TV for the forced confessions. And that was the response to the Hillary Clinton comments. What is needed now, for example, for her case, is to have intellectuals and allies and Nobel laureates and artists and everywhere, to support Sakina Mohammadi Ashtiani, not the officials. And yes, the problem is always with Iran is that the government is also very creative.
I want to raise one more point with Steve in the panel, and then we're going to open up to questions. So if any of you got any more topics to add, that would be great. Steve, in your small acts of resistance, in a way, is quite utopian, isn't it? Even in India, with Gandhi, the end result was partition, with 2 million dead. What happens when people in these various countries put the television sets in the prams and it begins momentum, and then people that want the same goal end up taking up weapons? How does that work, and what does one do?
You're right, of course, that the changes that come do not, well, very occasionally they sort of do, but usually they don't lead to some bright sunny uplands where things are perfect, absolutely not. And you're right, in case of independence, of course, that was extraordinarily bloody in many ways. But as regards the non-violence versus violence, I think actually Gandhi himself answered it very well. This was back in 1930 when, who knows what was going to come next. And he says, our strongest weapon against the violence, our non-violence, is the strongest weapon against the violence of the British rulers. And he proved absolutely right. And he was seen as slightly naive in that, thinking like, you're being beaten, including killed. And there were really horrendous examples, which it's odd that we I think even now we partly massaged it out. I mean, the enormous violence against the protests and actually strengthened those. And one of the stories in the book is about the Muslim counterpart of Gandhi, who is much, much less known, but who also achieved most remarkable things. So I think that it needs to be remembered that the people who will turn to weapons are often thinking, well, this is the shortcut. We've got a terrible regime, so let's deal with guns, and then we'll have done it. And of course, what that does is merely pave the way for yet more instability and violence. What we've seen where it has remained largely or overwhelmingly non-violent, those have been the places where the chances have been greatest for a real stability coming through the other side, when those who liked violence and ruled the country with violence have been displaced.
But we in the West, we were talking about Western pressure, and we in the West are constantly backing armed groups in these so-called freedom struggles, and have historically. So there's a bit of a contradiction there, isn't there?
I think there are plenty of, well, there are clearly many reasons for being extremely cynical about the way that Western governments have behaved over the years. I mean, that should be an absolute given, clearly. I think that one thing which was particularly bad was during the era of the Cold War, we had the worst, because it was locked in, that you could do anything. If you were fighting a Soviet-backed government, then that was absolutely fine, and the regime that, could be a torturing regime, or you could use whatever methods you liked against. And conversely, of course, on the other side, the Soviet-backed governments felt fine to have any range of human rights abuses. I do feel that with the end of the Cold War, there is at least the beginning of an understanding that actually morals matter. I mean, Afghanistan is a case in point where that lesson hasn't been fully understood in recent years, to put it mildly, despite the constant, what I'm sure the government's called harping on by human rights organizations and others immediately after, in 2001, 2002, saying you can't just work with these warlords who have appalling track records of what they have done to their own compatriots in Afghanistan. And again, we heard, especially from the US, but also, to be honest, partly from the UK, but we need to get the place stable, and this guy's got lots of guns in this part of the country, so we'll partner up with him and everything will be fine. And to put it bluntly, it wasn't. And so again, it's that naivety of those who claim to be those who understood things better, and actually fundamentally understood things worse. And I think that's the message. I would love it if, I hope in general it'd be found interesting, but it'd be great if a few kind of politicians with too much confidence were to take at least a couple of lessons from this, to think, okay, maybe partnering with bad guys doesn't actually help us at the end of the day.
I mean, Alice, you and your group of women have faced down people with guns on both sides, haven't you? Those that are supporting your cause and those that are against your cause. What have you done?
Well, the issue of the resistance of women has not really produced much result as we should really expect it to do, because what's happened is that when the trouble begins, when the women stand out, we back off. For instance, again in 2003, there were a group of women in the Delta who decided to go in the nude for fear of being attacked by arms. They stripped themselves, and for 2 weeks they were in the bush, stark naked, and protesting the actions of the oil company in the place. And at the end of the day, they backed off, because after 2 weeks, everyone is naked and nothing is happening. The world is not listening. No one is saying, leave these women now. So in the end, people say, all right, then we're going home, because if we don't go home, we are fighting with mosquitoes here, and we are hungry. So we have the guns, and it's always said, please stay low. So even youth, the students that used to stand up and want to take over government and say, well, this is our time, we don't want guns. Everybody backed off, because they now tell parents, you better warn your children.
But Tinasway, we in the West have seen over many years the Karen movement, which is an armed movement, but they are on our side generally, because how do they play out in Steve's scenario here? Should they lay down their weapons and be more imaginative?
If I may borrow Saif's words, Burmese government is also equally creative as Iranian government. What they've tried to do is the military government has been very successful in using a particular tactics. That is, they try to infiltrate and then split the group. So in Karen case, that's the tactic they use. It was very successful. And the group was split into halves. And then the group that defected to the regime, they were rewarded enormously. Mm-hmm. And suddenly people saw that group called Democratic Buddhist Karen.
Would they have made more progress if they were non-violent over the years? Has their armed struggle done them any good at all?
I think it would be difficult for Karen, because they took up arms to fight against the central government and many, many years ago. That was after the independence. Situation was different. That was after the war, and then Burma gained independence. And there were lots of arms as well at that time in the country. And also, when you look back Karen history, the Thai government, they used it as a buffer, and they were quite heavily armored at that time. And there were a lot of things that one has to take into account. Suddenly, the channel that supplying arms been cut off, and there was the regime infiltrated into current groups. So would they be better off if they had used non-violence
they had read this book.
I'm not sure. I don't know. Whether they would be better off. But given the situation as it is, they had very little choice but to take up arms.
Saeed, taking that over to your country. I mean, the Iranian film industry, for example, is now blooming. I had a friend that went into Tehran the other day and said that she went into a hairdresser and they had the most fantastic array of videos and that she could do her hair better than anything in London. And yet we hear suicide bombs going off here, there and everywhere. Which direction?
Suicide bombs where?
Suicide bombs. I mean, there's violence, there's bombing going off in bits of Iran we hear sporadically.
No.
And
well, there are some violence in the Baluchistan near the border there, but it's not very common in Iran to have suicide bombs or. The big problem now for the Grey movement or the opposition in Iran is the lack of successful media. So, although in spite of all these Twitter and Facebook and internet and everything, because we were all obsessed with this Twitter and Facebook here, but at the same time, Iranian regime also used Facebook and Twitter to identify people and arrest them, or used, for example, For example, one of the the controversy after the election was how Nokia, Siemens company, sold Iran a spy system, and how Iran used that system to identify people. So the big problem really is that how people, how the opposition is now reaching people in provinces where they're not as updated as people in Tehran, and then that remains really.
They have to get cleverer.
Yeah.
What about radio?
Sorry?
What about radio?
What do you mean by radio?
It's more difficult to filter, to observe, especially if it's sent from abroad.
Yes, but people in Iran do not listen to radio as much as people now in the UK, for example. BBC Persian radio was very popular in Iran, for example, 30 years ago when the Islamic Revolution occurred in 1979. But nowadays people tend to go to internet and television, and the big problem is now that the Iran is also very well equipped with jamming the signals for the television. But I think the biggest problem is that the mainstream media in Iran is still the state-run TV, and that is the big problem for the provincial people who do not have access to internet and satellites as much as people in Tehran.
All right. Let's open up to see if anybody's got any question about a small act of resistance over here.
I would like to ask the whole...
Could you say who you are and if you represent anybody?
My name is Dorothy Byrne. I happen to work for Channel 4. I'm not particularly representing them tonight. I would like to ask the whole panel whether they think that small acts from outside can make a difference. And I would also like to put Steve Crawshaw on his toes here, because he works for Amnesty. Now, if you were to work for a marketing company, you might have listened to everybody tonight and say, to help women or people in Nigeria, what you needed to do was to get naked women to turn up in every country outside the Nigerian embassy.
Yes.
There is no point to having normal protesting placards. But if in every country nude women turned up, I think that would be noticed, really, wouldn't it? In the case of Burma,
your first question now.
yeah, in the case of Burma, obviously the military must have some financial problems, so we should all send them boots. And if military boots were constantly sent to Burma, I can't help but feel that that was noticed. And in your case, I can't help but feel that if people turned up all over the world and chanted Allah Akbar outside Iranian embassies, would that be noticed? I'm not saying I advocate those things. I just ask, would they be noticed more than rather boring things that organizations do?
And I think the answer is that nobody is really suggesting people outside Iran to chant Allahu Akbar, because it doesn't mean anything here. So I think
we have 2 million Muslims live here.
Yes.
2 million Muslims.
Well, because that creativity doesn't mean anything outside Iran. So nobody's suggesting that people should do it, or nobody's encouraging people to shout Allahu Akbar on rooftops. And I think, for example, about the nudity, that these all creative small acts of resistance, they're just meaningful for that special time and that special place. Even nowadays, if people go and shout Allahu Akbar, it might not have any influence on Iran as well. So I think, yes, a small act of resistance is meaningful and would be good, as it happened, for example, for this stoning woman, when people outside Iran, in the UK, in the US, everywhere, signed up to the petition, and now this is why Iran still they are saying that they are undecided about the case, and that's the reason she was not stoned to death in the first week of July. Yes, that works.
Right, let's have a quick answer from everybody and then finish with Steve. The nub of your question is should small acts of resistance be done externally to help various societies move on?
Not boots. People did send things, but not boots. Women groups sent panties to the embassies all over the world.
Cannot be abused against the population. It's a good idea.
Yes, that was one period. There are several action taken by people from outside, dissidents from outside. But I think what is really required inside is people to make them aware of their rights. And that is more effective. And that is what people have been doing. Like, for example, there is one woman called Piu Thin. She is helping people who suffer from HIV/AIDS sufferers. They don't have access to medicine. It's very expensive. So she tried to raise money and give treatment, and she's ever so popular. And then now people realize that this is their right to have this treatment. And likewise, as I mentioned, trade union, our human rights organization, those are the things that have huge impact in the country. What the people from outside can do is they are doing in many ways, like helping the families, the prisoners' families, political prisoners' families. They're giving financial support, and they're taking some of the family members abroad to educate them. And these children, now they come here, they are they exposed to Western education, and they are very active from outside. They're lobbying very well, they're meeting various governments and trying to raise the profile of their cause and also profile of the country. So I think it's a two-pronged approach, dissidents from outside as well as people from inside. If they work together,
But
I'm sure,
Alice, naked women outside embassies, is it the way to go?
I think we'll talk about the radio. Information is very powerful. And I think that one of the problems that there is that is really serious in Africa is that we don't have electricity. So we could talk about internet and pulling on the radio that you talked about. And I know that there is a race, like the houses in Nigeria. Every single one of them have a transistor radio where they can be spoken to, so they know exactly what's going on. So on the strength of that, information is power, and money is an issue. Because we, women of Africa, we've been toying with the idea, because women who are abused, women who are trying to resist the terrible situation they are in, if only they can know that the whole world is thinking about them and working with them, they'll be empowered. And of course, that will run a resistance.
The essence of the question,
Yes.
I think, was
The nudity.
The essence of the question is something that will get people to stand up and take notice.
Yes.
Something that can make the dissident or the activist be cleverer than the government that's suppressing them.
Yes.
And if you were a marketing guy, Steve, Burma or Iran, how would you market that? What would you do? What would you take from this book?
Well, first, to take the question, I mean, yes, for an organisation like Amnesty International as a global movement, making sure that the pressures are there internationally is enormously important.
Yes.
And I do like that particular idea of protest, but there are many others, including on Burma, of just making people wake up
Yes.
to what is there.
And this is what Greenpeace does all the time, isn't it?
It does,
Yeah.
absolutely, but also Amnesty International, regularly will organise things which try to create interest. It must be said that at a certain point, I mean, I don't mean it toward Channel 4 News and DBBC does very, powerful stuff where other people aren't thinking about it, but to some extent the responsibility goes back onto media, that people don't want to look at the small acts of resistance, that it is startling that to see that if there's gunfire and lots of people are killed in a particular incident, suddenly it becomes a TV event, especially if tape exists of that happening. Yes. But if there weren't people there, for example, Andijan in eastern Uzbekistan 2005, or many other circumstances, then media, again, not Channel 4 nor BBC specifically, but in general terms, there is a sense that this doesn't quite matter because there wasn't that act of drama. Rather than saying you may not need the violent drama that goes with this, look at what underlies. But clearly an international organisation like ours needs to kind of put things on the agenda, but I think that media play an important role. What I've seen repeatedly over the years, during my time partly as a journalist, but let alone since joining Human Rights Watch and then Amnesty International, was unless it's in the media, Politicians are
They don't listen.
blindly uninterested. This was true of Darfur, it remains,
Yes.
and when it finally got on the front pages, and Britain was earlier than the United States, finally the politicians said, oh, we care desperately about Darfur, having not cared at all, even though they knew exactly what was happening and agreed with all of the material that Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and others were putting on their desk. The same is true today of Sri Lanka. It has
We're
very
moving
little.
away from the
Okay.
thing, so I'm going
On
to
the small
take
thing,
a
can
question.
I give you an example though of nice stuff?
Very
Yeah.
quickly.
It will be very quick, which I should have put at the beginning. Cash machines, South Africa, apartheid era. The older in the audience may remember that Barclays' involvement in apartheid was seen as shameful. Students were trying to protest. Barclays didn't give a damn. However, then in some university cities in Britain, people did some spray paint. I shouldn't advocate spray painting, but it was quite interesting. Next to cash machines, a pair of cash machines. One said blacks and one said whites only. And of course it was fundamentally irrelevant. You could use whichever cash machine you liked, but it was really embarrassing. And a year or two after that, Barclays pulled
So
out.
that's being clever.
And there was a happy ending. That was extremely clever.
Let's have the question just...
Yeah. Hi, my question is about sympathizers. By sympathizers, I mean people who are embedded in the existing power structure who are sympathetic to the agents for change. And I guess my question is, either historically or currently, do you think that sympathizers can be best used within the power structure, advocating for change in a subversive way, let's say, or crossing to the side of those more directly trying to bring about change? And I ask that from the perspective of an environmentalist working for an oil company that's been in the news a lot lately.
In fact, I'm just going to take one answer on that, Tinswa Shui, because you've got the sympathizers within the Burmese regime we were talking about, and then we'll move on to some more questions. Can they do anything?
Well, a lot of people like to think that there are sympathizers within the regime. I'm not quite sure, but a lot of government employees, they are very wary of what's happening in the country. But then again, every movement, if you look back, you need somebody to lead. Yes. And unless you have a strong leadership, it's difficult to mobilize people. And that is one of the reasons why they keep Aung San Suu Kyi, under house arrest. If she comes out, then things could change dramatically. So yes, there may be sympathizers within the establishment, within the regime. However, unless somebody is brave enough to lead them, it will be difficult to have any impact.
And this oil company, does that have any leaders within its ranks?
I think I've already made too many comments.
The gentleman next, John. Yeah.
Yeah, John Elliott. I'm a journalist living in India. I guess the example you took of Mahatma Gandhi in India, and that great act of small act of resistance when they stopped the salt being made on the beach of Gujarat, and that helped to bring down eventually the British government, is a great example of not being able to control the groups being powerful enough to effect change, but then not being able to control what happens when that change comes about. I remember some years ago I was persuaded that. Well, I wrote a story about a women's movement in Haryana outside Delhi for prohibition. And I went up and the interviews were organised, and I interviewed the women, and the men all stayed quiet in the villages. And the story ran in The Economist, and the following month the Chief Minister's son took over the black market in liquor. The women's movement may have got the headlines, but it didn't actually achieve very much in the end. But my other stray thought, of course, is that the Taliban was seen as a small act of resistance when it first started to march up through the south of Afghanistan. Another example of how things don't always turn out quite as they may seem as they're going to when such a thing starts. My question is, all your examples, I think, are against our opposition to dire regimes. What chances there are of these sort of movements starting in what is basically a democracy, but where an awful lot of things are appallingly wrong?
Like in
Britain. Like Britain, if you like, exactly. I mean, I was going to say like India, but everything I think I read about India, including all the roads in Delhi collapsing, seems to be happening in London as well.
This is where people can be...
So, can you have small acts, with Humphrey's help, can you have small acts of resistance against corruption, against bad governance and all the rest, in what is basically a democracy, where India does show the big act of resistance of throwing out governments it doesn't like. The poor and everybody else votes and the government has to go. That's a big act of resistance. But in between those 5 years, let me go back to my main point. All your examples are against dire regimes. Can this be done against regimes that aren't quite so dire?
So essentially, we might tell you, essentially what we're saying here is you can be clever against the government without the fear of getting your head chopped off. And therefore, is there a grade of acts of resistance that can be used in democracies veering towards dreadful dictatorships?
I mean, the starting point of the book was ones where people had taken enormous risks, because it was just so astonishing that people could be so brave and indeed witty in the face of being jailed. But no, to take your example for India, for example, clearly democracies, working democracies and problematic democracies, there are great acts of resistance. I mean, there's a few which you'll be well familiar with in the book. There's the case of the mass texting after there was a murder case, where there was a general feeling in India that the establishment had won out, that there was corruption and justice had not been done. A mass telephone texting campaign, which ended up with a Supreme Court decision suddenly going the other way.
There is criminal cases that have gone the wrong way.
That's right, and that was kind of striking, that kind of sense that, SMS is not just kind of something on how to win Big Brother. It is something which can create great change. The Panties campaign, again, you're probably aware of that, the Valentine's Day protest against Indian nationalists. Again, these were things which were not creating huge risks for those who did them, but they did have significance. And not to forget, when we started writing, I thought we won't do any democracies at all. It'll all be the really bad places. And then I realized, of course, places like the United States, functioning democracy, my God, the power of the stories from the 50s and 60s, which were quite shocking. And when you realize it's actually in parallel time to South Africa, what was happening. I mean, so, within democracy, you can have corners of truly horrific stuff.
Well, Obama's election itself was being clever against the establishment, wasn't it?
Absolutely so, and was unthinkable to many.
Shall we take?
I'm Carolyn Heyman from Peace Direct. Just responding to John's question, I saw a wonderful film about a campaign in India for freedom of information, and it was very, very funny. They went around singing songs which said, "Do we want a Cadillac? No. Do we want a tractor? No. Do we want this? No. Do we want that? No. We want information." And it was just the sort of imaginative way that they put across the fact that actually information was much more valuable than any of these other things that, in the Bollywood world everyone would aspire to. So I think that's an example of using the same sort of imagination and humour in a functioning democracy, sort of.
Can we just pass I forgot and then back here, yeah. All in the front. Anybody in the back? Can we have there's one, two, okay, we'll...
Hello, good evening. I'm Norbert Stute. I'm, from Better World Links. My question is, governments and corporate media are not very... they like to frame issues. And they're not very conducive of small acts of resistance. What can be done about it?
These are oppressive governments or democratic governments?
At the moment, I think about democratic governments.
You just rest the microphone can go. Democratic governments. Alice, a swathe of democratic governments in Africa.
Well, I'm here to see a democratic government in Africa. Because what we have, I think what we need to understand is that what is being brought forward, presented as democracy, really is not democracy. Look at, for instance, Kenya, where people went to the poll. You would say, yes, that would have been a democracy. But when the people voted, Mr. President lost, but swore himself in. So there we are. Everybody came. Thousand died as a result of that. And what then happened? There was, an expansion of constitution, and then they created the position of prime minister for the loser. So to make peace. We saw it again in Zimbabwe. Now we have Zimbabwe now have the prime minister. Then you ask, so how has any of this helped those people who actually resisted the outcome or the refusal of the loser to leave? How do we push democracy to Africa? They will tell you, no, this is the way, this is African democracy. So, but it really is an oppressive regime.
So it's not done because people are afraid of doing it or because they're not clever enough?
Well, I think what's happening is that whatever Africa churns out, the world will recognize. From the moment, and this is where we'll go back to the Channel 4 question, well, not for Channel 4, but is it when, no, what needs to happen is that when the rest of the world, the whole world says sorry, we're not happy about this, perhaps Western government will be slow at recognizing some kind of made-believe African democracy. I don't know what that is. It's very similar to oppression. So we don't, whatever we bring, the West will take. So I think, yes, when everybody gets up and says, sorry, we don't agree with this, then obviously that is going to begin to fuel confidence. It's going to build confidence within African people, amongst Africans. And then they will have the courage, I would say, to say, right, okay, we don't agree. But right now, everybody says yes. Anyone who comes in, they are the author of the result. They know the result before it's actually done. They don't allow other people to vote. So they come out and we're taking it. So that's the way I see it for now.
Okay, the lady here.
Okay. About the media, though.
Yes.
Oh, forget the media.
The media is not focusing on small acts of resistance.
Let's
my name is Linda Ramsden. I'm the director of ICAD UK, which represents the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions.
Okay.
So we resist the occupation. A lot of really great points have been made and really inspiring stories told about the small acts of resistance. We've also made reference now to the fact that it's governments that don't do the right things, you know, whether it's in a democratic society or a non-democratic society. My question has to do with civil society. In getting more of civil society to care nowadays, to care about what's happening in our own country over what's wrong, to care about what's happening in other countries. You know, have you thought about this? And certainly when you wrote the book, Steve, you know, was it to get people to care, to get people to be involved, to help mobilize civil society, to get them out of, you know, a position where they think they have no power and actually we can do it? I mean, would you comment on that and how, we can really start seeing civil society mobilized far more on a global scale?
Go for it.
Thank you. That's very much the question. And yes, of course, that was absolutely the thought. And put differently, it was, yes, what we can achieve, but kind of the subtext, as I went to some of the politicians' things I've heard over the years was, excuse me, who's the naive one here? Because there's still that sense, these little things are kind of like, oh yeah, well, it's nice, kind of soft and fluffy. It doesn't really get anywhere, does it? If you're going to tell me that what people were doing in the United States in the late 50s and early 60s, risking their lives within a democracy, let alone what people are doing in the Soviet bloc, let alone what people are doing in Latin America, let alone what people are doing in Burma and Iran today, all of that matters. And I think we just started writing the book. But when I remember spluttering and hearing an interview on the BBC World Service, in other words, hearable in Burma, which made it more insulting, was some Western diplomat airily declaring that the protests where people were risking their lives day after day in autumn 2007 clearly wouldn't get anywhere. It was absolutely doomed and it couldn't get anywhere for all these various reasons. Now, I'm not saying that that was wrong directly, because the Burmese regime is a pretty tough place to deal with. But the fact is that by not thinking you will get anywhere, you get nowhere. And conversely, the people who have achieved things are the people who thought, actually, we can get somewhere. And to pick up, you mentioned Obama, which obviously is the kind of the end of the arc, if you like, from what started way before, but what the stories we concentrated on the 50s and the 60s. And then people saying, the idea of getting a black president in a few decades is just utterly unthinkable. That wasn't just in the 60s. A book came out while I was living in New York in early 2008, and the title, I'll probably slightly misquote it, but something like "Why We All Love Obama and Why He Can Never Be President," written by a distinguished black American historian.
But that's
now that kind of sense, and I don't want to go into politics of that, you know, what his politics are, but nonetheless, that sense of not believing, I think, is extremely important. That's why I quoted the Czeslaw Milosz quote earlier of like people always looking back and saying, "Oh, that was achievable because of this." And now we understand why the Soviet Union fell apart, why communism fell apart, why the Latin American generals. Well, actually, when people were doing the little things, very often there was a bunch of cynics, usually in very powerful positions, who said nothing could happen. And that applies for the landmine ban, to take a quite different thing, where you had very, very powerful politicians, some of whom are named in the book, but I won't name them here, who said, in the real world, in your world, you might be able to achieve a landmine ban. In the real world, that's quite unachievable.
I just
and 2 years later, that landmine. So that's the kind of sense of pulling together. And civil society has enormous power.
I want to throw the question to Saeed, actually. How much can civil society grow in Iran before it gets its wrist slashed or its head cut off? I mean, it's a wonderful thought. But how much could actually be achieved?
Well, I don't understand the question, but I think, could you rephrase it?
Well, yeah, but it's very real, isn't it? I mean, how much can you gather, create a civil society, move forward for reform, without getting stopped violently by the government?
Well, the problem is the civil society in Iran is ready for the change, but the problem that it's not going for the change is the resistance from the government, which is so huge.
Can it push?
Do you mean how much people can push for that?
Yeah.
Well, I think they've already paid. They've already paid the price. It's nothing more that they can pay. There've been hundreds who've been arrested. There've been tens of them who've been raped in the prisons. There's nothing more that people can do to say that we are ready for the change. It's just that it's not a time yet, and probably because people in provinces are not ready, or they've not already, but they're not in the same path to join the protesters in Tehran at the same time.
So the civil society has to spread to that level that it is in the cities, has to spread throughout the whole of the country.
I think it's in the whole of the country. It's just a question of they're not synchronized. They're not in the same timetable. They're not in the same path because they're not leaded at the same time. It's not that the people in the provinces are happy with the government. No, they're not happy. And the Green Movement is not just limited to the people in the capital, Tehran. No, this time it's about whole country. The problem is that the people in the provinces are not as well updated with the people in the capital, and not as well mobilized, as you say.
Okay, thank you.
Steve, thank you for your book. So I'm here. Hello. Thank you for your book. I'm just wondering, non-violent resistance, it's about real people in real places doing things that hit the government or corrupt companies right where it hurts, isn't it? That's the essential idea. Mm-hmm. I wonder where the future is in non-violent resistance, particularly in technology. I was in Kenya only a few weeks ago. I made a tweet to do with corruption in the local government. Within 2 hours, I was being followed on Twitter by the Kenyan government. A friend of mine recently camped out in the Iranian embassy, protesting about someone's arrest in Iran. He was twittering about it within a few hours. He's been followed by the Iranian government. I'm being followed by BP on Twitter. There's things like YouTube, videos that go viral on YouTube. And what is the... I guess particularly thinking about young people who are passionate, who do care, but very often don't feel they've got a voice. They're stuck here in London. They don't think they can get anywhere or do anything. Mm-hmm. What do you think is the future in technology, in actually immobilising a silent army to actually making the world aware of global issues? Because if my teenagers knew that there were women in Africa naked, they want to see a video of that. and if that goes viral, that makes a statement, doesn't it? And I think what for you is the future use of technology, where we can actually make people aware of situations, but they could be using technology to make others aware.
Okay.
Go for it.
I suspect that you and many others in this room have got at least as good or better answers than I did. And all I feel confident of, and in a way it's come from what you've just described, is the potential is absolutely massive. So one of the last, I suppose the last substantial chapter in the book, is it called Connected? No, it's called something different now. But anyway, Digital Descent it's now called. And that takes some, I mean, Iran obviously plays an important role in that, but others. And I think the very fact that governments are feeling alarmed by this, in the sense already as a backhand compliment. The more people that do it, the more impossible it becomes to stop it. Uploads from Tehran, for example, I'm not going to get the figure wrong, but I think it was 5,000 a minute at a certain point of uploads of material to the BBC Persian service in London during the election period and the violence then. Some of you may have seen there was a piece a couple of days ago about a group based in Kenya especially, which is kind of taking all the information and then just making that available more widely on the web. And I've been in conversation with a couple of others here in London who are trying to do something similar on a global scale. I feel there are masses of things like that. I personally have to feel completely ignorant. Although I write in praise of tweets, I haven't yet tweeted in my life, so I guess when the book comes out I might dip my toe into that water, I'm not sure. But clearly the power is absolutely real, and that sense of things going viral. I mean, in a terrible and heartbreaking sense, and I think Saeed said it earlier, Neda's death was powerful on any scale when she was killed in the streets of Tehran in June last year. But the fact that it was actually seen on YouTube then had a more dramatic effect. It was probably, I don't know if you would agree, the single greatest pressure it became on the Iranian government of anything else. That one little scrap of digital material, if you like. And that clearly applies to facts, be it in Kenya, be it in Sudan, be it anywhere else. People who can say, well, I know this is happening in this village, well, I know this is happening in this village, I know this is happening in this village. Put those together, and in a way that I think perhaps we can't begin to imagine, but I feel that in 10 years' time, actually in 2 years' time, in 1 year time, this is changing so much day by day, and I think that brilliant people can harness those possibilities to be able to put it before governments in a way that governments will no longer be able to avoid their responsibilities. When we come down to it, that's what lies below a lot of what we've been talking about tonight, is that governments feel very able to ignore stuff unless it's put in front of them in a way that they simply can't ignore. And I think that the digital world can play a fantastically important role in that.
And I think, what Iran proved that technology is not enough. In 1979, back in the Islamic Revolution, the statements from Khomeini was distributed in the country by papers. People were photocopy them and say they were not Facebook or Twitter at that time, and the Islamic Revolution, which was backed by the non-violence protesters at that time, it happened. So technology is not the whole issue. It's good because in the 80s in Iran there was a massacre in the Evin prison where lots of protesters and lots of dissidents were hanged and they were killed, but there was no news of it in the media at that time. Even now, people are not paying attention. But now, when someone, for example, is going to be stoned to death, everybody in the world knows that. So this is good about technology, and at the same time, it's not enough. Especially with Iran, more and more Iran is getting isolated, and more Iran is ignoring what the international community is thinking of it. So
and governments care about that, do they?
Yes, in Iran, they don't. Now it's a time that they don't care even in what is said in the international community. A year ago, for example, when Mazhar Bahari of Newsweek was in jail, when Hillary Clinton commented on him, he was released in few days. This year, when Hillary Clinton commented about Sakina, she was put on a TV for a forced confession. Iran is getting into a point where it's ignoring the international community, and that is bad for Iran, and that is, I think, what US and West is pushing Iran to go to the isolated country. This is very bad.
Okay. And China's survived like that for 2 decades, hasn't it? There's a question at the back.
Hi, I'm Nick de Croo, not affiliated with any organisation. I'm just wondering, a lot of the things we've been talking about tonight have been quite confrontational acts. What about the sort of acts? How important are they when they're non-confrontational? I know recently, for instance, we celebrated at the Barbican and also another exhibition at MoMA was the posters that came out of the Polish Revolution, because the artists were able to take hold of what was happening, I suppose, in individual villages, begin to build on that. And actually, they liked Shakespeare because though they thought they were seeing Shakespeare on the stage, they actually interpreted that as the government versus the people. And I recently attended a Sudanese poet, and apparently if he turns up in a town and the word gets out, maybe 1,000, 2,000 people will be there to hear his poems. And his poems might be about David and Goliath, but everybody knows what David and who Goliath is. Just wondering, is that just another way of doing things? And how important is that when it perhaps seeps over into the artistic and the cultural side of a country, that everybody, just by seeing the movies or just by seeing the plays that are there, is resisting?
The short answer is yes. I mean, actually, I personally, and I know John Jackson, my co-author, we both love. There's a chapter in the book called it was originally called Cultural Revolution, now called Marshalling Arts, and is about the amazing way that the arts play a role kind of sideways. There's some great examples from Zimbabwe, there's some fabulous examples from Poland and elsewhere in Eastern Europe. And although it didn't make it into the book, I'm particularly fond of the fact that this is a very Polish story, the fact that one of the great Polish 19th century classics, more or less their equivalent of Hamlet, was banned because it was too political in 1968, and that ban indirectly can be said to have led to solidarity, which led to the end of communism, so all to do with a kind of performance of a revered 19th century classic. Arts in general, poster art, the arts, I think play a very important role, that kind of sideways. Sometimes they're, again, described as being soft, but actually they're a kind of soft way in, and regimes have enormous difficulty in confronting. For example, in Zimbabwe, there were two characters. One was the opposition leader and one was Mugabe, and it was difficult to work out exactly what to ban. And they, I won't go into the rest of the story here, but it was an entertaining way of confronting. They wanted to jail the people, but couldn't quite jail them in the end. I think it's very important.
Just there, too. Where's the microphone? Oh, there's one over here. Okay.
My name's Angela Yo. I'm a journalist and filmmaker. We'll be working for AFP Video in China starting next month. I wanted to ask Steve in particular, what's the most interesting China-specific example that you have of unarmed resistance? But a current day example. And my second question is to all the panellists. What's the biggest mistake that's been made by a campaign, successful or otherwise, and what lesson could be drawn from it?
I'm trying to remember I think I can sort of remember, although I pronounce it badly, the Chinese word I was just grasping for. You're probably already aware of it, but I was particularly fond because of the obliqueness of it. The cuddly animals, which look a bit like llamas, and I hope it won't sound too obscene when I say it in my non-Chinese, but kaonima, which means this particular kind of animal, and became very popular, lots of videos. When it's pronounced in a proper Chinese way, although it kind of is usually transliterated as Caonima, it then becomes what the way we've translated in the book in Latin, it's sort of a vague equivalent of Fakkymava was how we decided to translate it. I'll do it slowly. Fakkyamava. Try and say it aloud. That's what CAO, that's what kaonima apparently means. So there were endless YouTube videos which were about this. Now, on the one hand, this could just be a way of delivering an obscenity on a video, but of course it wasn't. What the massive popularity of those videos in China was all about was saying, you don't want us to say these things, and we will. So there's these great videos of gambling llamas with a kind of Disney soundtrack. And fundamentally, what they are saying is, you, the Chinese government, will not silence the kind of things we want to say. And the kaonima, the llamas, or indeed the Fakkyamavas, were not defeated. They managed to defeat those who were the censors, and again they kind of used a play on words within Chinese. I love the obliqueness of that, and it's rolled on way since we wrote that story originally. It's kind of had further impact with the regime not quite knowing how to handle it. So there's one that I kind of really enjoyed. More broadly, the more serious one, which we actually conclude the book with, which kind of is the underlying where are we, is Many in the room will be aware of Charter 08, whose very name picks up on Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia, which in turn had come out of a bunch of, going back to the arts question, a bunch of pop musicians who got locked up, and that kind of led to Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia, which led to the end of communism. Charter 08 picked up on that, and you could do an easy narrative of Charter 08 which said, what impact did that have in this massive country? Hardly anybody knows about it. It's had no impact. It means nothing. The same could absolutely have been said in 1977 about Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia, written about abroad, but no one very interested in Czechoslovakia. So I see that as, the question mark. I'm not saying Charter 08 will go anywhere, but I think the question mark of what civil society is thinking and where it goes, I think remains really interesting. And yeah, I'll leave it.
We'll have to, because we're running a little out of time, so we'll take two or three more questions. There's one at the back there. Sorry about the last half of the question there. You could get that.
Alistair Smith, representing nothing in particular. Humphrey, could I direct this one initially at yourself and then over to the panel, perhaps for a couple of examples or your thoughts on Iran and Burma. You've used the phrase a couple of times this evening, Humphrey, the tipping point. Could I ask you to sort of define what you mean by that? And then if we could perhaps throw it over to the panel and see maybe what you think is the tipping point in certain circumstances.
Yes, I think that came out of what we've been discussing, and I actually wanted to just sort of refer, when we were talking about the cultural elements there, the Iranian film industry is becoming global and very popular and very professional. I think what is a tipping point that can lead a society towards a peaceful transition, which could take generations, such as happened, say, in Taiwan or South Korea. And a tipping point where there's no actual tipping point, it's sort of a gradual movement where you have the pressure groups, the non-violent acts pushing the government, and the government listening and moving. Or, as one has in many places, in Burma, Iran, might happen, we don't know, whereby there's a tipping point, it suddenly goes into violence. And the civil society groups are not strong enough to hold it together. And I think that's what when I keep talking about the tipping point, because we see it time and time again. Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan possibly is moving towards it. And then all over Africa there's a tipping point where the civil society hasn't managed to hold things. Yes. I don't know whether...
Yeah, I think that's important. I mean, I think tipping point can mean different things. And for me, one of the really interesting ones, it's great to have a question, gives me an excuse to say something I wanted to say anyway, actually. Ryszard Kapuscinski, the Polish writer, wrote brilliantly in the context of Iran, The Shah of Shahs. And it was about the Iranian Revolution, but it should never be forgotten, or can be forgotten, but it's interesting to remember. It was published in Poland as a kind of parable of its own, because it came out at the time that Solidarity was just in the middle of being repressed by the authorities. And he talks about the zigzags of precipice. He defines a particular moment and a particular event in Iran, and he says, this is the moment where the man has stopped being afraid, and this is precisely the beginning of the revolution. And then he goes on a bit further, and so the sense of repression and then liberalizing, repression, liberalizing, and at a certain point neither of those can help the government survive. And he concludes that bit saying, and so by reversals, detours, meanderings and zigzags, step by step, he, the Shah, drew nearer to the precipice. And it's very difficult to identify those things as they happen, although I guess I've been privileged enough to live through a couple in Wenceslas Square and in Leipzig in East Germany and elsewhere. But afterwards it's very easy to see exactly how those zigzags were happening, and those tipping points, I think, are fascinating for me.
Okay, we're going to just take questions, I think, and then see if we can, just a very quick one here.
Eva Yashevich, Le Monde Diplomatique Polish edition, and the Free Gaza movement. My question is about when small acts actually are incredibly risky and you're up against a perceived democracy, i.e. Israel, and the stakes are so high, and a question of sort of martyrdom and self-sacrifice comes into play, and particularly thinking about this in light of the Panorama documentary yesterday, which was just a complete whitewash and mouthpiece for the Israeli government. Even my Polish mother's friend, who's not political at all, said, "Did you see that documentary made by the Israeli government?" I was part of the flotilla and one of the organizers of the flotilla, and the way that the Muslim activists in particular are represented, or the Mavi Mamra, they were all just hell-bent on martyrdom, when in fact every single participant in the flotilla, as part of a very diverse movement, was taking a risk, was risking their lives. So how do you undemonize taking the ultimate risk, and how do you undemonize within movements groups within movements that are coming under much more fire? In the case of the Palestine Solidarity Movement, I'm thinking about Muslims in particular, but obviously you have your own examples.
Saeed, could you address that whilst we move the microphone backwards?
Protesting in Iran especially is very risky. In all terms, it doesn't matter if you're protesting in the streets or if you're blogging in your blog. It's very risky. But if you, for example, about Neda's story, Neda Agha-Sultan, she was not into politics. She was not seeking for power. She even didn't vote before the election. She didn't even succeed to vote. But she was out there in the streets, and she was not thinking about a risk because she was courageous. And not courageous, superhumanly courageous, but because she wanted to resist to the government, she wanted to be there in the protest. She risked her life and she died. So there is always this risk for everybody, and sometimes, like Neda's story, she was not even expecting to be killed at the time. She was not even thinking that it's that risky that she would be killed.
You are expecting it, or it could happen.
Well, many times, yeah, as you said, in Palestine, you are going to be killed, and that's a very controversial
So there's
issue.
a chance
Yes.
of getting killed.
Yes, and even in Iran, there were times like there were one governmental occasion, Ashura, which is Islamic occasion in Iran, where government very publicly said that if you come out, then you'll be killed. But still people went out, and many of them were killed. Yes, there are sometimes they take risks very voluntarily, as we see many times in Palestine.
Okay, we're moving to the back.
My name's Noel Khan. I'm not representing any organisation, but I wanted to ask Steve in particular. WikiLeaks and Julian Assange are providing a platform for a lot of people to give unarmed resistance, and that making a very real difference in the world, I feel. And Amnesty, as far as I can see, haven't really come out in full support. I appreciate the reservations, but can you say here what the official line is from Amnesty in regards to WikiLeaks with the Afghan war diaries?
Well, first let me just say it's an incredibly, I guess I'll take for the assumption that most in the room know the situation of horrendous civilian casualties in Afghanistan and documents in connection with that, and then the leaking of that onto WikiLeaks. I'm not at the centre of these issues, so I mean I should frame it in those terms. But I think that two things I guess I should say immediately. One is that Amnesty International cares passionately about the civilian casualties in Afghanistan and has done some of the most important work that has been done on that theme, full stop. So that's a kind of given. And so, it's not as though we don't want this stuff to be out there. Amnesty International's work has been putting that information out there as carefully as possible. The rider that goes with that, or what goes alongside that, is the fact that for Amnesty International, as indeed for any decent human rights organisation, as they are, for any human rights organisation or for any responsible media, protection of your sources comes pretty high up the list of when you are working out how you're going to get this important information out. Amnesty has a whole range of different ways of ensuring that confidentiality will be protected. I know that responsible media do as well, but it's actually more codified within Amnesty because we are constantly confronting those challenges. So for us, the issue is really important. I think that others will need to work out, and we have said, I haven't been directly involved in those negotiations, but I know that we have said that we are willing to help in order to make this happen, but we need to feel there is an understanding all around that confidentiality is not something which can be kind of played around with. This is more important than confidentiality. There kind of is nothing more important than confidentiality where it comes to protecting lives who might be at risk. So that's the basic bottom line.
One question here, one over here, one here first, and then over here. The gentleman in the blue shirt there, yes.
Oh, hi, I'm Anthony Butts, again, not representing anyone. So just wanted to pick up on the question the Channel 4 lady asked. It seems that with these sort of the penalty for not tripping the tipping point with the non-violent resistance can be pretty severe. And I'm just wondering, I'm a bit naive on the whole subject myself, but you know, seeing as governments, I mean, for instance, take the Georgia-Russia war, it was fought primarily by PR organisations feeding the media. I'm still getting emails to this day from them. The question is that, you know, things like the Gaza flotilla, you know, all these non-violent acts, would they not be better off hiring professional PR companies, at least on the side? I say this in a mischievous way, simply because to make these, you know, make these acts count a bit more, you know, so that they're seen by as many people as possible, you know, to try to trip that tipping point quicker.
Professional PR companies to make the resistance more clever.
It's a great mischievous suggestion. I mean, I think probably implicit already in your question was the fact that it might sound nice. In practical terms, it backfires when journalists quite rightly say, ha ha ha, look, it's this PR company who came up with this great idea. And even to this day, the Serb opposition movement, which I respected, as I said earlier, not the politicians who were very bad, but the kind of the street resistance, I respected enormously. But to this day, there are articles that continue saying, oh, well, they didn't really do it themselves. They had this bright PR people who brought them the ideas, which kind of is a sliver of truth, but misstates a much greater truth. I mean, I think that in a sense, it is the work, I'd love to feel that a kind of a book like this can help do it, but certainly it's the work of something like an organisation like Amnesty International to bring those issues right there and saying what is being told more generally is an untruth. Here are some ways in which ordinary people are suffering in a way that they should not. And then again, it does kind of go back to the media to go, oh, okay, I seem to have been fed a line when I went to that nice foreign ministry briefing in country X, who told me that the real problem is that these people, I mean, the shameful lies which are told about different conflicts by different foreign ministries, democratic foreign ministries around the world, is truly shameful. And it is interesting how quite often journalists will feel they've talked to the nice person who's the spokesman of that foreign ministry, and he always seems nice, and you can have a nice drink with him. I'm sure he or she is telling the truth. And often that's frankly not the truth.
We've always got our deadlines to meet.
And there are deadlines to meet. And so I think that that's a kind of a cleaner way, if you like, is for both journalists and for human rights organisations. PR can help, but actually I think it hinders as often as it helps.
Okay, gentleman in the blue shirt there.
Yeah, my name is Guy Horton. I work on Burma mainly. Can I return to the issue of international solidarity and really the issues that the lady talking about Gaza raised? My question really is, and perhaps to address to the Burmese lady on the panel there, is during the Saffron Uprising, could that Saffron Uprising have been coordinated with people from the outside world in the international community? And could it have been organised in a way that there were people from the international community there in Rangoon, actually in Burma at the time? And could it have been organised rather like Gaza in a sense, that people would have participated in those demonstrations, maybe 50 foreigners, 100, maybe 200, would have completely internationalised the whole thing? We saw when that one Japanese journalist was killed, the entire relationship with Japan, the second largest economic power in the world, was very, very badly damaged between Burma. So could it have been possible, should it have been possible, that say 50 well-prepared people, like on the Gaza flotilla, could have been there, could have participated, could have been well-prepared, and could have made a real serious and fundamental impact? Could that have happened, do you think?
There are a lot of soul-searching after the 2007 protest ended in bloodshed. One has to remember that when it started, nobody was expecting the protest to become huge. It started on August the 15th, as I said, when they announced that without warning, the fuel prices gone up for 500%. And then pro-democracy dissident leaders came out into the street. And just 2 or 3 people, you could the footage around on YouTube, if anybody is interested. And there was a woman just trying to mobilize people, saying that, you know, we have to do something, the prices have gone up. And then that, from there, gradually, the protests gain momentum. And
but should the British Embassy or UNICEF or sent their people out onto the streets to join them?
There were questions that why NLD, National League for Democracy, the main opposition party, why none of the members came out. You know, there were questions. Should they send their people? I don't think they would, and a lot of people outside felt that they should, but I doubted very much that they would send their people. Again, to answer your question, should there be more coordinated act between people from inside and people from outside? I think everybody was caught by surprise. Nobody was expecting this, the monks to come out. And then once the monks come out, then it gained momentum. And when it happened, I think in fairness, people from outside, they were quite not so well prepared. So from hindsight, yes, it would have been better coordinated, it would have been more organized, but that was not the case. Should they have, as I said, now from hindsight, a lot of people said we should have been better organized. But would that make any difference? You know, when you look back Nargis, when Cyclone Nargis hit Burma, there was a naval ships docking near Burma, in the southern part of Burma. A lot of people are asking the Western governments to distribute food by just flying the helicopters and dropping food from the air, but the Western governments were reluctant to do. At that time, everybody was wishing that Western government should should be more proactive.
So the rules of diplomacy stay intact in these.
The rules of diplomacy stay intact, and also, you know, I think. Then the reaction from the people is that they felt very much abandoned by everyone.
Okay. We're going to have one more question from a very patient gentleman here. And whilst that, I'm going to follow up by asking each of you in your tweet, 15 seconds, to sum up the act of resistance you do for your own communities. And you, Steve, can do Britain, because it's a democracy. But let's have this question.
Hi, my name is Samir Mahmood, and I practice as a barrister here in London, and I'm not representing my chambers. My question was just following on from the question that was asked by a lady, I think in purple, about Palestine. We're talking about a situation which has gone on for 70 years. We've got the situation in Kashmir again, which has gone on for another 70 years. In contrast, we do have heroes like Nelson Mandela and Aung San Suu Kyi, who are patient resistance. But when you're talking about conflicts that last almost a century, approaching a century, whether it's Palestine and Israel, 70 years, Kashmir, 70 years, individuals who are not of the status of the Burmese leader or of Nelson Mandela, they can often feel fatigued and just despair and feel that they have reached the end of the road. There was a talk here a few weeks ago called Combatants for Peace, and it was touching to see Palestinians and Israelis working together against Israeli forces, and it's purely a peacekeeping sort of a group of people. I couldn't get some of my friends to attend, who feel very passionately about the topic, and they just felt that there was no point in even attending. The conflict was too vast for small acts of resistance. I wonder what any of you can say. I know what Said said about Iran, but I think with respect, the situation in Palestine is of slightly different nature.
Steve, I'm going to straight in very quickly, if you can. This is these historical conflicts that go on for centuries.
Yeah.
What can these small acts do?
I think they can do a lot, or put differently, the violent acts on either side of these different conflicts are, of course, what prolong and prolong and prolong. And both sides have a terribly good reason why violence is justified on our side, because we need to get this solved once and for all. And of course, both sides in many different places of the world are actually prolonging. And thank you, it gives me the chance to acknowledge, which I hadn't done before, and I do think that in the Israel-Palestine context, that the non-violent protests, first to take your point, are absolutely more dangerous in many ways. I mean, the risks are huge that people are taking, and they do have real impact. And that's what's interesting, is you can see again and again, is that they are more difficult to confront than the violence. And that, I think, is true of pretty much all the conflicts around the world, that the governments which do not want to give a full set of rights in whatever context that be, whether it be Balkan, whether that be Middle East, whether that be in South Asia, all of these places have in common lack of rights and the reluctance to confront that. The non-violent resistance and the non-violent coming together seems to be enormously important. But yes, it's fantastically difficult. I mean, I have to say, this is not a book, this is a book of admiration for what has been done.
So you haven't addressed it in the book?
What, Palestine? Yeah, no, Palestine is there, absolutely. It takes a story of Bet Sahur, for example, a tax strike there, and the fact that the shameful failure by powerful governments, most notably obviously the one in the US, at the Security Council, blocked support for a very important non-violent act of resistance, and you could see that as having impact down the road. Billing, the village of Billing is important, which actually isn't in the book, but I would happily have that in the book as well. And of course, on the Israeli side, testimony is breaking the silence. Those who from the Israeli side say the truth needs to be out there. In a sense, it's a book about truth, but it's certainly clearly not for the authors sitting in comfortable London and New York, respectively, to say, oh, you should go and do this, because the dangers are enormous. So it's a story of admiration for those who have achieved so much, and believing that things can be achieved.
I've come away with many thoughts, but two images, and I want to see if we can get some more. One is of the naked women against the machine guns, and the secondly is the Barclay Bank teller machines with black and white. They're sort of entrenched in my mind. So I wondered if each of you could encapsulate, and you've only got 15 seconds to do it. If you can't, just pass. Give us an image of your own communities based on this. Saeed?
Well, in Iran, there was at some point a student activist was arrested, and he was speaking in the university, and he had to flee the university wearing chador, this black cloth. And the government tried to humiliate him because of wearing that chador. And in response, the bloggers, everybody took the pictures in chador, and everybody, all men and boys, they took pictures with chador.
They were great.
Which was very great.
Yeah.
And from Burma, anything to encapsulate a resistance there? It can be imaginary or kind of happened.
Well, the very popular sign now is cross, not to vote in the elections, forthcoming elections. So everywhere there is a cross. And if you see a cross, that means that do not vote. And which means if by not voting, boycotting the elections, that means that this election will be whatever the results will means that it's only the votes that the government and the government people who put pressure to vote the government, the result of those votes.
Alice?
Africa. Power is corrupting, absolute power is corrupting absolutely in Africa. And what we're doing is pull on the issue of civil society. We are strengthening. We believe that the little acts of resistance that we have is not making any impact, because the media, the Western media, need to support us more, because the media they have there is corrupted. It's been paid to publish for them. Civil society outside need to come together and to be able to work with us. We're working to create African Women Commission, that other people that kind of raises the profile of the African women across Africa to the international community, where it becomes, once we have recognition for that, we're struggling, we're looking for volunteers. That will become a simple act of resistance, which no African government can work against, because then the international community will feed in with us, and of course those governments who refuse to hold elections. I know in Cote d'Ivoire The man is supposed to have been elected, go to the poll 5 years ago, is still there. We go to Uganda, the man is still very much not moving. We go to Zimbabwe, it's the same thing. Nigeria, nobody is voting anybody. So we have all of this. But the women are completely, they can go in the nude, they are doing everything, and people are being killed. It's not easy to stand in front of a machine that is killing people. People are being killed all the time. So we know that to be able to make the impact that is required, we need to strengthen civil society. So we are hoping to create, we're working to create, we're lobbying seriously. Last week we wrote to Her Majesty to please give us the nod for gender transformation, for the reformation of Africa, because that's the only thing that can do it, where the women can stand shoulder to shoulder in New York and say to Nigeria, elect. If it's not working, then look for a peaceful way where everybody can go and have their own place and have peace. Go to Uganda. You removed Idi Amin, but you've been there now for many, many years, much longer than Idi Amin did. So don't hand over to your son, please move. Go to Senegal, please, we are standing against you. You've been there too long. You go to Ivory Coast, it is time you call proper election. Go to DRC, the raping of women got to stop. So until we raise the profile of women up to that point when the rest of the world can stand with us, where the world media can say, yes, though you are not Winnie Mandela, but we are listening to what you're saying, nothing will change.
Okay, not 15 seconds, but an excellent book. Steve, 15 seconds, something really clever.
It won't be clever at all. Let me try to do 2 into 15 seconds, because the UK is difficult for me. Foreign policy I would take, and I would put it almost into the 2 words Sri Lanka, or 1 word, 1 phrase, Sri Lanka. If people could go out of this room and have a sense of how bad things are and how little the UK and other governments want to confront what's happening in Sri Lanka, look at any of the website work of Amnesty International, any other organisation, Crisis Group, Human Rights Watch. That is important, and to put the pressure on both media in the room, but also on the politicians. Sri Lanka is a failure to have confronted sufficiently. A nice story I will take you, not from my own country, but my partially adopted country, as it were, Poland, which I feel connected to in many ways. Going back to when communism was still there, I talked about the pro-communist demonstrations they had. You had to wear something red, lipstick, nail varnish, red shirt, whatever it was. And if you hadn't got any of those, people started buying a kind of pizza which had some ketchup at the end. And the person who was running this was thrilled that she was getting so many customers. But he said, no, you have to shut this down because you're selling too many. She said, no, but I'm doing great business. The guy at the front of the queue said, can I just have the ketchup in that case, please? Because all I really need is the ketchup. The guy who just wanted ketchup was arrested, and within a year of that, democracy came to Poland. So I think that's a nice
ketchup. Thank you. Fantastic panel here. Great ideas.